And now let me introduce our speaker. Paulette Cooper was born in Belgium to parents who died in the Auschwitz concentration camp, and she was 1 week from being taken there also. After the war, she spent years in various orphanages in Belgium, surviving near-death experiences until she was adopted by the Cooper family and moved to the United States at age 6. She became an American citizen when she was 8. She began her freelance writing career in 1968 after completing a master's degree in psychology. A few years ago, she met the man whose father had saved her and her sister from Auschwitz. She has since reunited with friends from the orphanage and will now describe what happened to them. Paulette Noble Cooper is the author of 26 books, including The Scandal of Scientology and Elvis Was Jewish, plus hundreds of amazing and amusing anecdotes about Jews and Judaism. She has won 9 writing awards, is a Brandeis Honors graduate, and a Holocaust survivor. She lives in Palm Beach with her husband and writes a regular column for the Palm Beach Daily News. Thank you, Paulette, for being here.
I think she covered everything, so I'm going home. We're here to commemorate Kristallnacht, which happened in Germany when the Nazis came in and they torched synagogues and they vandalized Jewish places and they killed almost 100 Jews. 4 years later, 1942, in Belgium, things would get a lot worse. Jews had to register. They wore armbands. They were taken off the streets, buses, trains, sent to Auschwitz, and killed. There was a Jewish man who got on a train, and the Nazis stormed the train, dragged him out, took him to a holding camp called Mechelen, where he was sent to Auschwitz and killed. He was my father. 4 days later, his pregnant wife, my mother, gave birth to me. My father never saw me, never knew he had a little girl. I never saw my father, which breaks my heart. He left behind 2 children, me and a 2.5-year-old, my sister Susie. Now, when I was a few months old, my mother needed milk, but it was very dangerous for Jews to go out because people were selling the names of Jews for a bag of sugar. So she hid her 2 children, me and my sister, in a back bedroom, and she went out. And she was seized by the Nazis, and she was sent to Mechelen, and she was killed in Auschwitz. My mother was 31 years old. Fortunately, for me and Susie, a neighbor saw my mother when she was seized, and she saw that she didn't have her 2 children with her. So we had to be in the house. And fortunately, she knew my mother's brother, and she called him. But my uncle realized he couldn't carry 2 little children. So he asked a friend to come with him to save us. And they went to the house, and they went to the back bedroom, and they got us, and they hid us in an orphanage in the country. But when they came back, it was so late they had missed their curfew, and a Nazi guard was waiting. And my uncle was smart. The 2 of them split. One went this way, one went that way. The Nazi guard shot at the friend, got him, took him to Auschwitz, where he later died. My first year of life, my sister and I were hidden by several people. Records show at least 4 people hid Susie and me, and they would get caught, and we managed to escape. Finally, though, Susie and I got caught. I was 11 months old. I was sent to this Nazi camp called Mechelen. I was given prisoner number 843. I was listed to be on the 21st transport to Auschwitz. Now, I should explain what these holding camps were. When they caught the Jews, they didn't just send them to Auschwitz. They would wait until there were a number of people, and they could put them on these trains called transports when they had enough people. And it sometimes took as long as 6 days for them to get from Belgium to Poland, because the Germans would pull these trains off of the main tracks when the trains passed, because they didn't want people asking questions when they saw the cars, where people were probably screaming and pounding to get out. These places had no windows. They had no toilets. Thousands of people died en route. My sister Susie and I probably would have died on that train because we had no parents to take care of us. And if we had survived the transport, the Germans shot children at Auschwitz as soon as they got there, and we would have been killed. But 1 week before, while Susie and I were in Mechlin waiting to go to Auschwitz, somehow or other we were saved 1 week before. The 21st transport left without us, and many of the 1,554 Jews on that transport went to their deaths. The dangers for me were not over. I remember one terrifying night when the Germans were bombing the orphanage and all the kids were screaming. Fortunately, it didn't hit us. But I had a much closer call another time. Hitler wanted all of the Jewish children killed. We were known as hidden children. Queen Beatrice of Belgium was a friend of Hitler. Hard to believe he had friends. She persuaded him to only kill half of the children. And the Nazis stormed into the orphanage that I was in, and they went left, right, and all the children on one side were sent to Auschwitz to be killed, and my sister Susie and I were on the side that was saved. Another time, the Nazis came to the orphanage, and by the way, I was in 5 different orphanages, but one main one, and they told the woman who was running it to prepare the children to travel the next day. And she realized that that meant we were going to be taken away. And she spent the whole night grabbing and hiding us all in homes and fields. And in fact, I remember being transported that night on the back of the truck. Anyway, in 1945, Hitler decided that all the Jewish children should be killed. And fortunately, the war ended before we did. In 1948, I was 6 years old. I was adopted. But my sister Susie remained in Belgium. My aunt and uncle adopted her, but abandoned me. And over the years, when I came to America, I had many questions about my life that actually would not be answered until a few years ago. The first and most important to me was, how was I saved 1 week before? Why didn't I go to Auschwitz with the other 1,554 unfortunate souls? And the second was something that haunted me for years, and that's what happened to my 2 best friends in the orphanage, Dee Dee and Janet. I had spent 6 very lonely years, especially in the last 2 when they took Susie and not me, and having no parents, and in fact no visitors. But I had 2 best friends, Dee Dee and Janet, and we were inseparable. We were called the 3 Graces because we were always together, and we were the cutest, smartest kids, and they wanted us to be adopted by better parents in America. And I knew that Dee Dee and Janet had been adopted, but they changed their names to the adopted family. And for years, I couldn't find them. Meanwhile, I was adopted by the Coopers, wonderful people who lived in New York and Palm Beach, and they were conservative Jews, and we had a kosher home. I grew up in Oriental Point in Mamaroneck. I graduated Brandeis in 3 years with honors, got my master's, wrote my thesis on early childhood recollections, because I was intrigued that I remembered so much from the orphanages. I became a PhD. That's a PhD dropout. I became a writer at 28. I've written 6 books, many different subjects, but I happen to love dogs and cats. So 5 of them are on dogs and cats, and now I write the pet column for the Palm Beach Daily News. In 1972, I wrote the first major expose of a fascistic cult called Scientology. I was not a member. I was an investigative reporter. And then 15 years later, while I was still writing, I became happily married to Paul Noble, who is the most wonderful man in the world, and here now. 5 years ago, the Village Voice wrote this big article about me and how I was the first to expose Scientology and what happened. And the story mentioned that I was in New York to visit my sister Susie, because I had told the reporter that I had come up. Susie was depressed, and I mentioned to the reporter, I didn't think he would print it, I didn't want him to print it, that I had been hidden in Belgium, and that Susie and I had been discussing how were we saved from Auschwitz, and we didn't know. Well, a Belgian reporter spotted the story in the Village Voice, and he called and he asked me some questions. What was my original name before I was adopted? What was my date of birth? And he promised me that his papers had such a large circulation in Belgium and Holland that within 24 hours after the story would run, I would know how I was saved. I didn't believe him. The story ran in the Belgian and Dutch papers. 24 hours after it came out, I got an email from a Dutchman named Peter. And he had read the story and he wrote me. And he said, I think it was my father who saved you. And he asked me some questions. I kind of ignored the email because I'd had a lot of mail that day, and all this is upsetting to me, and people were writing me about their Holocaust past, and some weird mail, like Mechelen has become a museum, and the curator wrote me an email and asked me to come and speak there. I mean, the last place in the world I would want to go. Anyway, I went to sleep, and I woke up during the night, and I began thinking about Peter's email. And I remembered that in his email, he asked me if my mother's maiden name was Minkowski. And I didn't think that was in the news story. So I woke up during the night, and I pulled the news clippings, and they were in Dutch and Flemish, and I couldn't read them. And I was looking for the name Minkowski, and it was not there. And I realized that this man, Peter, knew something and was probably telling the truth. We corresponded, we still do. It turned out that Peter's father and my father were best friends in the Navy in the 1930s. And Peter's father became high up in Holland in charge of the food distribution. And he was working with the Nazis, but he was not sympathetic to them. Peter explained to me that people's lives depended, everybody who knew what was going on didn't like what was going on, but they couldn't speak out. And they were not Jewish, but actually Peter confessed to me that the grandfather had converted, so that they were especially sympathetic to the Jews because they were partially Jews. So when Peter's father found out that the 2 children of his former Navy buddy, were about to be sent to Auschwitz to be killed, he had inherited a house that was the equivalent of $60,000, and he sold it. And he bribed a Mechelen guard with food and money to let us escape. By the way, Peter's father was almost caught. The Nazis suspected that he was the one in back of our escape. And he told me that 6 Nazis came to the house that night, took his father to jail, questioned him all night, and he never broke, and he never told them where we were hidden. An interesting P.S., the guard, who was named Philip Schmidt, you can look him up on the internet. He looks just like someone out of Schindler and has a huge German shepherd, which he used to sick on the Jewish prisoners. And he was the last person to be executed in Belgium in 1954. So he was a bad guy, but he was good for me. Peter, the son of this man who saved me, and I and Paul all met in London a few years ago. And the Daily Mail wrote a great story about this reunion. And if you want to know more, my website, paulettecooper.com, I did put up the Daily Mail story. So this article in the Village Voice led to the Belgian and Dutch papers, and it led to the answer to my big question, how was I saved? But my other big question was still unanswered 2 years ago. What happened to my 2 friends? And before I tell you that, I'm pleased to report that my sister Susie is well. She left Belgium, she married an Israeli, she moved there, she became a widow, she had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and I'm very pleased that each were named after our dead mother and father. And they have children, so while Hitler killed 2 of us, there's now 9 of us. And in fact, we have someone here who's a friend of mine from Holland. He told me that his family had 80 and that there were only 5 left afterwards. During the Gulf War, I began to worry about Susie's safety, so I flew her to New York where I was living, set her up in an apartment. She became a saleswoman at Saks Fifth Avenue, also for a while down in Florida, Bal Harbor. And we were cheated for the chance to grow up together, but now we're close and talk on the phone regularly. But what about the other orphans? I had no way to track down Dee Dee and Janet without knowing their names. But then a strange thing happened. A couple of years ago, I received an email from a woman in Brussels, and she had bought a large house, and she found all these photographs and papers, and she realized that this house had been an orphanage and had been a major orphanage. And she found lots of photographs of children, including one of me at about 2 years old saying, Paulette. She sent me a number of photos, and most of the people here have parents who had photo books and showed them photos when they were young. And I hadn't seen photos of myself when I was young, so there was this huge disconnect. It was very strange to see these pictures. Below the picture of Paulette, it had my original last name and my date of birth. So she did some research, and she tracked me down from those stories in Belgium and Holland that I told you about. And we also correspond, and this summer she plans to have a memorial service in Brussels at our former orphanage to our parents who were killed in the war, and Susie and I will be there. Now, along with finding photos, including me, Dee Dee, Janet, Susie, she found adoption records. She had the new names of the orphans that I couldn't find. And I learned Dee Dee's adopted name, and I tracked her down. And sadly, my friend Dee Dee did die young. And I think I've located her son, though, and I'll call him. Janet was the one I really wanted. I knew her as Janet Schindelheim in the orphanage, but now she was Janet Oselka. I looked on the internet, and I found she had a Facebook account, but she never posted. You know, there are people that take out Facebook accounts and then don't do anything. And for months, she didn't respond to my emails. I just couldn't get in touch with her. And then I saw that she had 32 friends, people who liked the page. And many of the names were Hebrew, so I figured she probably was in Israel. And I emailed them all, and there was no response. And I waited about 2 months, and then I emailed all 32 again. And bingo, one of them emailed me back and said, I think she's in a nursing home in a suburb of Haifa. So at that point, I went back on the internet, found the names of every one of the nursing homes in around Haifa, called them, and one of them said yes, she was a patient there. Well, I was so excited. I said, after 70 years of searching, I said to Paul, let's go to Israel tomorrow. I want to see her. And he said, no, let's just see what's happening. So I spoke to her nurse, and I'm afraid this is an unhappy story. Years ago, she was getting her master's degree in Haifa, and she crossed the street, and she was hit by a car, fell on her head, and for the past 55 years has been a brain-damaged quadriplegic. I sent her photos of herself from the orphanage. She did recognize them, and she remembered me. My one phone conversation with her was very bad. It was hard to understand somebody she talks like she had a very serious stroke. She couldn't use her hands to hold a phone, so they put a speakerphone up. It was almost impossible. I try to email her. I email her for Jewish holidays, but there's little to talk about because her nurse told me not to mention to her that I'm a writer or if I'm traveling or that I'm happily married, because she's very bitter about how her life turned out, and I can't blame her. Finally, I turn to how my life turned out and why I ask myself, how did I survive all those close calls? What if my neighbors hadn't seen my mother taken by the Nazi guards? What if the neighbor hadn't known her brother? What if he hadn't risked his life to get Susie and me and hide us? What if Peter's father hadn't read that news story? No, first, Peter's father. What if he didn't know that the 2 children of his former best friend were about to be killed? What if the Nazis succeeded in bombing the orphanage or killing me once I was in there? What if I ended up dying young like Dee Dee or severely damaged like poor Janet? Is what happened to me, was it all luck? Was I in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the right time? Was it beshert? I know that almost everybody here knows the meaning of beshert, that things were predestined to happen. And sometimes I think it all happened because God looked down at this little orphan, me, and said, I want Paulette to live. And here I am. Thank you.